73 questions.
With Max.
Podcast.
Genetics.
Human.
Archaeology.
Denise events.
Spencer Wells.
Neanderthal.
Metabolism.
Ancestry.
Where in the world did we come from?
I am
Unique.
DNA.
Genome.
Jeff Rose.
Monsoon. Nubian.
Debutant.
From
Saadiat.
Abu Dhabi.
Welcome to 73 Questions with Max, featured by Moog. This week, I am joined in the studio by three very special guests. Two cave people, THH288, who goes by the name of Betty, and HTT822, otherwise known as Agatha. A little later in the show, I'll explain exactly just how and why we are joined by these two very special guests. And our third guest this evening is Harrison Croft, a world-renowned paleoanthropologist and geneticist who was recently featured in National Geographic for his discovery of human bones in Antarctica. Our big question this week is, how do we know that humans living around the world today ultimately came from Africa? This really is one of my most favorite questions in the field, and I hope that ultimately, using the tools of science and evidence from the present, we'll be able to decipher the past. Well, Harrison Croft.
Oh, just call me Harry.
Harry, thank you for joining us here today.
Thank you for having me.
So, could you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself? I have it written down here that you have, 6 PhDs?
7 now. Yeah.
7? My
Yeah,
goodness.
a lot of work.
Wow.
Well, basically, I am a paleoanthropologist and a geneticist. My recent big discovery was finding those bones in Antarctica. You might have heard of that.
Yes. That was certainly very exciting when it came out.
Yeah.
Our listeners, we did a whole podcast about that.
It was an exciting finding, though.
Yes. Well, shall we get on to this week's big question? So, how do we know that humans living around the world today ultimately came from Africa? Could you enlighten us a little bit about that?
Well, I can certainly try. I'm not sure how familiar your audience is with paleoanthropology and genetics, but I'll try to keep it sort of a bit superficial.
Oh, just go ahead, please.
Well, the story starts basically during the time of Darwin, when On Descent of Man, he writes about how noticing the extinct species living in separate regions of the world, and how he suggests that because monkeys, great apes, and gorillas originate in Africa, perhaps we also originate in Africa as well.
Wait, sorry, how do we know that monkeys originated in Africa then?
Oh, we found the earliest fossil sites of great early apes in Africa, so that's why we think that.
Oh, okay, carry on.
During the early Miocene, yeah. So just because of our relation to we assumed relation to monkeys, and because we know monkeys originate in Africa, therefore we originate in Africa.
Right.
As you can see, this is circumstantial evidence, and at that point in the 19th century, this wasn't really proven.
Mm-hmm.
Only recently, with technology like genomics and development of biotechnology, were we able to trace our DNA to our common ancestry in Africa.
Right.
Should I talk a bit about those genetic research?
Yes, please,
Okay.
go on.
Okay. So there were two big projects really that told us we originate in Africa: the mitochondrial Eve project and the Y chromosomal atom. Mitochondrial Eve just means we traced our own mitochondrial DNA back to African origins, and Y chromosomal means Y chromosomal DNA back to African origins.
I'm sorry, just to go and interrupt you here, but I think our listeners may not be so well versed on the terminology as us.
Yeah.
So could you explain to us what DNA is and how it links to hereditary?
Okay, yeah, sure. So DNA is basically the molecule found in most of your cells that tells your cells since conception how to develop.
Mm-hmm.
It encodes basically all of your characteristics,
Right.
most of them. And it is a long molecule. It is a long molecule consisting of 4 letters, A, T, C, and G,
Mm-hmm.
in a certain pattern, and that pattern is actually what defines those characteristics.
Mm-hmm.
In your cells, there are different kinds of DNA, but and for this purposes, there's 2 really interesting kinds: Y chromosomal and mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondrial DNA is in something called mitochondria in your cell, and to cut the long story short, it's really good at looking at these things because it really quickly accumulates the markers that we need to look at.
Mm-hmm.
When we look at your DNA and we try to trace your heritage and ancestry, we don't look at the whole sequence. We look at particular markers which set you apart from other people.
Oh, okay.
And if 2 people have similar markers, that means that we can tie them back to the same ancestry branch. Yeah. basically. So mitochondrial Eve was the paper was released in 1987 in Nature, and what it concluded was that the maternal line, because mitochondrial DNA is inherited from your mother always, the maternal line can be traced back to Africa, because the African group of people sampled had the biggest number of divergence, so they were there for the longest.
Okay.
And similar with Y chromosomal DNA as well, but that paper was released in 2000 with more advanced sequencing methods, because the Y chromosomal DNA is much longer than mitochondrial DNA. Yeah. Actually, on that Y chromosomal DNA, I had a good friend who worked on it.
Oh, did you?
Yes, Spencer Wells.
Oh, fascinating.
Yeah.
I think I've heard
Great
of
guy.
him.
Great
Yeah.
guy.
Yes. So I've heard this name a couple of times. You mentioned it, but who or what, perhaps more accurately, is mitochondrial Eve?
Oh, mitochondrial Eve. You can just think of that individual as the common ancestor of all of our maternal DNA. She's the common ancestor of all people on the planet, as far as mitochondria. And she would have lived around 200,000 years ago in Eastern Africa or something.
So this was a real person?
It would have been an individual with this DNA, yes.
Oh, okay.
And originally in 2000, they traced a Y chromosomal atom 59,000 years ago, but now we think it's closer to 2,000 years ago. So it's possible that we're living in the same time period.
Oh.
Yeah, very interesting. But I think genetics is not the only reason. It is not the only field in which we have determined African origins of our species. Looking at archaeology, and we can trace the earliest fossil sites of many of our hominin species to Africa, from Homo erectus to Homo heidelbergensis, which we think might have spawned Neanderthals and Denisovans. Also, what is really interesting is once Homo sapiens left Africa, which is our modern humans, they mixed with Neanderthals in Europe, and we know this because we found in the DNA this admixture between these two groups.
Amazing.
Yeah, very interesting.
Wow. So what you're really saying here is that our modern human ancestors were living in Africa, and then they decided to go and move out and settle the whole world?
Well, yes and no. There was a lot of back and forth. People were leaving Africa, people were going back in Africa. There was a lot of mixture.
So it wasn't such a great leap forward.
It wasn't. It's not that simple. It was more like a gradual migration out of Africa, and on the way, people were changing as well and going back.
Okay.
It's a much more complicated process, yes. But what we can say is that whatever we define as our human species has first appeared in Africa. What is also really interesting, if you think, recently we've discovered Homo naledi, which is this particular species of the hominin tree, which is where we are as well, in South Africa, which seems to suggest, while our species was alive, modern humans, it was alive as well. And Homo floresiensis is also a species found in an island in Indonesia, living as recently as 12,000 years ago. So these species were living at the same time as we were, and they were our ancestral cousins.
Wow. So what I'm a bit confused about is during all of these years, thousands probably of living in Africa, no Homo sapien ever decided to leave. They just kind of stuck around until this great Saharan pump I've heard about.
Oh, the Saharan pump basically means that as our planet revolves around the sun, it's affected by a gravitational pull of other planets, and it experiences wobbles in its rotation, in revolution.
Okay.
And those affect our climate significantly. We enter a period of ice ages and interglacial, so it's warm, cold, warm, cold, warm, cold. And as this climate changes, the Sahara spreads and shrinks.
Oh, so in like a pumping motion.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So during one of those expansions, it pushed some of our species out of Africa, and it pushed some others deeper into Africa, into the south.
Oh, so the movement was very much dependent on that wobble of the earth and another.
Yes.
Okay.
That was actually discovered by a countryman of mine, Milankovic.
Oh,
yeah.
Interesting. So how many of these movements out of Africa were there exactly? When was the first?
Well, we tend to simplify and say there were three main exoduses.
Okay.
But there have been, as I said, it was more complicated. People were going back and forth all the time. The first one was Homo erectus, the oldest member of our species that we found, 1.8 million years ago.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And he left Africa if you think about all the technologies we have today and we're moving around and sometimes we're lazy, like, oh, I have to go there. Imagine 1.8 million years ago, they made that travel from Africa to Asia.
He couldn't just get on a plane, could he?
No,
Or a
no,
boat. He had
there were
to
no planes.
had to walk there.
Oh, yeah.
Amazing. What a long way.
Yeah. And then the second exodus was the Neanderthals and the Denisovans. The Denisovans went to northeastern Asia and the Neanderthals to Europe.
And these are other hominins, you say? Neanderthals and the Denisovans?
Yes, pretty
okay,
much,
okay,
yes.
okay.
And then the third exodus was our most recent ancestors, which is the Homo sapiens, which is our species. They left Africa around 60 to 70,000 years ago,
Mhm.
and then they spread to Asia, Europe, across Bering Sea to North and South America. But as they spread, they mixed with the Neanderthals and Denisovans. And we can see that in the DNA of our current people living there.
So I have in front of me a publication which was given to me by some of the producers here, which it talks about tracing our lineage back to Africa via language.
Oh, yeah.
I don't suppose you've heard about this, and perhaps you could expand upon this theory a little bit.
So recently, I think in 2011 in Science, someone published a paper tracing the language tree group using phonemes, which is basically all the distinct sounds you make with your voice in your language, all back to Africa. I'm not a linguist, so I don't really understand the intricacies of it,
Mhm.
but what I can see is that it's similar to the genetic argument. The African languages have a higher diversity of phonemes, and hence that means they've been there longer, and perhaps that is where we originate, or at least our language as well. It's very interesting.
It's amazing this multidisciplinary approach to understanding this big question.
Yeah, very interesting.
Thank you for expanding upon that for
Oh,
us.
you're welcome, don't worry.
Well, thank you for that insightful insight.
English first language.
Okay. Well, thank you for that wonderful insight. Have you got any last words or comments to make?
I think what I would point out to your audience is that to keep in mind that it wasn't just one migration out of Africa. There was a lot of back and forth. Things are not that simple. Also, what I would like to say is that, reiterate, is that our modern human species didn't suddenly go out of Africa and conquer the rest of the world and make the other species go extinct. We mixed with a lot of them, example, Neanderthals and Denisovans.
And more perhaps as well on top of
Perhaps
that?
there is part of the DNA that shows that we've mixed with other species, but we haven't found those yet to compare. What we also know, as I said, is that other hominin species were alive during our time as well, as recently as 12,000 years ago. So these are things we need to keep in mind. Also, Neanderthals, just in Uzbekistan, we found a site that shows that a buried child ceremony with, I think, horns around the burial indicates that the Neanderthals were very much capable of ritualistic behavior. So ritualistic behavior just means if a certain community has rituals, that means that their cognitive capacity has expanded enough to understand what that means, which means we were not the only people that were thinking.
Well, thank you very much for joining us here today, Harry. I'm afraid that's all we have time for, as we have to get on to our two other very special guests.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was very interesting to have you. That certainly was very interesting. Now, on to the second part of the podcast, 73 Questions with Max. Now, I'm joined here in the studio today with Betty. Betty is from the Middle Paleolithic period, would you believe it? Betty was engineered at the George Church's lab at Harvard. Now, I shan't get into the specifics of the whole ordeal as such, but anyway, where exactly are you from?
You could say I'm from the region of current-day Dhofar, Oman. My family moved all around the place and all the time, but I think from the looks of it, from the map, I stayed within the region.
So, do you think your families have migrated from different continents before, do you think? Say, Africa, maybe?
I don't know. All I can say is that I've lived my whole life here. However, my mother has always told me about our great-great-great-grandparents coming from a place far away, a place near a beautiful river. And maybe that might answer your question, but I don't know.
Okay. So, what exactly was your role in your group?
I was a tool maker just like my father. I specialized particularly in weaponry.
What is it like being a tool maker?
First of all, I love my job, but but it's not for everybody indeed. It is such a rigorous job. The strength and energy that goes into creating the precise angle is unimaginable. But, in the end of the day, sharing the meat and the stories of the hunt from my tools makes everything worth it.
Did you do special training?
Definitely. A lot of practice in perfecting my angles and edges. Also, I have this routine of lifting big rocks.
If you could choose your job again, would you choose to be a toolmaker or a hunter, do you think?
Toolmaker without a doubt. Some might say hunting jobs are the best these days, but without tools we make, they're nothing. And we're the ones aiding people's everyday life to improve the quality of their lives.
What was the cutting-edge technology of the time?
When I was still alive, we started to make composite tools. My aunt found this resin that works as an adhesive, and ever since then, my brothers and I would produce stone pieces that would later be hafted on a shaft with it.
So I have with me today a number of artifacts which were found with your remains. Do you recognize any of these?
They are indeed familiar, but I think they seem a little bit glossier and darker than I last remember. Let's see. That piece is mine, so is the piece next to it in the middle, and that big piece is the rock I once struck too hard and ended up with a wrong angle. I thought I would get to it later on and get more out of it, but I guess others after me have done the job.
So what did you hunt using these tools?
Well, the hunters, they took these pieces and they hunted basically every type or sizes of animals that they could find basically. And, I don't want to brag, but I was particularly proud of this giant cat with dots that we caught. It had such a tasty meat.
How did you make this tool?
I just followed the way my father has taught me. It is what he learned from his father, and his father learned it from his father, and it has been a secret technique that has been running in my family, and I just can't share with an outsider like you.
Okay, I won't take any offense from that one. So listeners, since you're obviously not here with us today in the studio, I'm just going to do my best to go and describe these tools to you. So what these tools are is what we call classic Nubian level-wire cores. They are defined by 3 distinct characteristics. Firstly, they have a triangular or subtriangular shaped core. Secondly, they have a faceted striking platform. And lastly, it is characterized by having a preparation of the median distal ridge on the working surface. This particular Nubian core I have in front of me exhibits a combination of distal and lateral shapings, which we term type 1 and 2. Assemblage like these belonging to the Nubian complex have been found throughout the Nile Valley catchment system and high plateau, and also around the Paleo lakes of Eastern Sahara and the Egyptian Red Sea hills. Although the directionality of the population movement still remains an open question, the prevalence of Nubian tools in southern Arabia provides evidence for demographic connections across the Red Sea.
Hey, anyways, is this tool yours? It seems to have the exact density I want, but I think it just lacks an edge. Could I make it a little bit useful with my hammers?
Please no, Betty. That's my phone. I really do need to have that back, thank you.
Okay, fine, but at least let me take my tools back. They're mine, and I can hear the stones calling for my help.
No, please, Betty. That doesn't belong to me. I'm just borrowing these. Could you just put everything down?
Fine.
So, okay, I'm glad we're over that now. So, could you just tell me, what do you hope to see from your children?
I hope to see a preservation of our tool making techniques, and because it's a tool making technique my ancestor passed on to me, and I hope I get to do that to my generation as well.
Well, thank you very much for joining us here today in the